Oh, g'day team, it's your old mate the Kiwi Badger, and we're out here again on the old boulevard M109R. So, where are we going? And what are we doing? Well, we're just going for a little bit of a ride down one of my favourite rides. I only want to go for about an hour or so. Yeah. But I was having a conversation with someone, and they wanted to know more about what it's like working inside a prison. For those of you who have been around, you know that I used to be a prison officer of 16 and a half years. For those of you who have just joined, yeah, I used to be a prison officer for 16 and a half years. Or a correctional officer, prison guard, whatever you want to call it, a screw. So yeah, the term screw, that's probably, we'll start there, the term screw. So screw is a euphemism for, it's an English term, which refers to my previous occupation. And what, oh, a bit of a top dressing plane there, those guys can know how to fly a plane. Screw, so where do they get the term screw from? Some believe it comes from turning thumb screws. Some believe it comes from the from when they used to screw the door locks shut on very old jailed prison cells. But where it comes from is where they used to do hard labour. They sometimes had to turn a wheel for no other reason than it was a meaningless task. They would turn a wheel, and in order to make the wheel harder to turn, they would turn a screw which would increase the pressure, therefore making it harder. So yeah, that's where it comes from, screw. There's a lot of prison terminology and euphemisms. Shank or Shiv. A shank is an improvised stabbing device or cutting device. And the way they used to go, the way they got those names was that back, it's an American term, shank. Back in the old days, probably in the late 1800s, where they used to supply prisoners with shoes. Down the middle of the shoe from the heel towards the toe used to be a metal piece of reinforcing to make the shoes rigid, and that was called a shank, and the shank of the shoe. And the prisoners used to remove that piece of metal and sharpen it on the concrete and use it for whatever they were going to use it for, mainly for protection or to assault or kill someone. So that's where a shank comes from. And Shiv is exactly the same thing. It's an improvised stabbing device or weapon. Yeah. There's probably other jailhouse terms that I know, but I suppose I don't think of them as novelty terms because I used them for many years, so they're just kind of normal. But if you've got any questions around prisons and that kind of thing, don't hesitate to ask. I'd like to enlighten. The reason I like talking about it is because a lot of what people think they know comes from TV programs and movies. What actually happens inside prisons and jails is not accurately reflected on TV or on the big screen. Some aspects are, but not always. So people know what a firefighter does and what a cop does. People know what an ambulance officer does because those jobs are out in the public eye and you can see what they're doing. But by virtue of a prison's design, you know, it's a hidden profession. A lot of people don't know. They think they know, but they don't know. And a lot of people's opinions on prisons and how they think they run are derived from movies and quite misinformed. One question I used to get a lot was, do prisoners have TVs? And I would say yes, they do. They do have well, some of them have TVs. It depends how well behaved they are and how much money they have. So they do have TVs, and quite often I'd get the comment when people would ask, oh, you're prisoners, oh, what's it like inside prison? Oh, do they have TVs? And then you say yes, and they go, oh, that's too soft. They shouldn't be allowed TVs. They should get nothing. And I understand why people think and feel that way. You've got a certain population of, or a percentage of the population, who have committed crimes or offences against their community and people in it, and they don't deserve to have those privileges, you would think. But let's be honest, we expect as the general public that when we put people into prison, they come out of prison better humans than what they were when they went in. And if you cut people off from everything, and including civilization and the news, the weather, and things like that, you make people worse. And currently in New Zealand, the recidivism rate sits up around the 70 percentile. It's high, okay? Our prison population is disproportionately represented by Māori, and they make up about, again, 70% of the prison population, but they only make up 16% of the general population. So out of 5 million people, oh bloody hell. So out of the prison population, I mean out of New Zealand's population of 5 million people, 16% are Māori, and inside prison, 72%, I think it is, 72% of the prison population are Māori. So highly disproportionately represented in prisons. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. But anyway, treatment of prisoners. Prisoners get certain things, and it's to keep them in touch with the outside world in an attempt to help rehabilitate. People say, oh, you're too soft on them, prison's too soft, it's not tough enough. And I would argue that point, actually. Again, people go, oh, prisoners get 3 square meals and a roof over their head. Yeah, they do. They have to, because that's the Geneva Convention and the Human Rights Act. Okay, humans have rights, and I do appreciate and acknowledge that there are some hardworking, honest, good people out in Civvy Street who do not get 3 meals a day and who do not get clothes put on their backs and do not have a roof over their head. I totally get it, and I'm not arguing the point. But as a government department who has incarcerated people, the government has to play by certain bits of not only national legislation and law, but international law. And one is the Human Rights Act, or the Geneva Convention. Another one is crimes of torture. There's a international statute around crimes of torture. So there was a case in one of our prisons many years ago where some prisoners misbehaved, and a couple of the officers put them in a yard, stripped them down, and turned a fire hose on them. And that was deemed to be a crime of torture and against the Human Rights Act, and humiliating. And those staff not only lost their jobs, they were charged with those offences and ended up serving time. So how do you go about doing your job, you might ask? The way I look at it is that the prison is their world. We built it, we govern it, we run it, we supply it, but it's not our world, it's their world. And I always reminded myself that I was a visitor in their world 8 hours at a time. I had rules to enforce and policy and procedure to uphold, but it's still their world. They live there, and they view, whether you agree with it or not, or as a staff member and officer, whether you agree with it or not, those prisoners see their cells as their home. it's their house. Some of them take great pride in keeping their cell tidy and clean and organised. And it's like you'd have your home. You'd have your family pictures on a bookshelf. They have their family pictures stuck to the wall, normally with toothpaste, because we don't give them sellotape. Because sellotape, you can make things like tattoo guns and Shanks and Shivs. Or you can use enough sellotape to restrain officers, which is not a good thing. So they don't get sellotape. So they would use toothpaste as an adhesive to stick their pictures to the walls. Even soap sometimes, depending on the brand. So I was very mindful that I was a visitor in their world 8 hours at a time. And another fact is if they decided to coordinate and organise themselves and pull together, there is nothing stopping them, generally speaking, from taking over a prison. The reason that staff, I'll refer to corrections officers as staff. The reason staff can do their jobs is because the prisoners allow it. They outnumber us 20 to 1 and usually are more prone to violence, are fitter. They train in the yard with fighting, although prison rules are made up with bans sparring and training in the yards, because we don't want them upskilling, and you also don't want them hurting each other, because then you have to take them to the doctor, and that's, yeah, you don't have to take them outside the wire because they were doing something they shouldn't have been doing. So yeah, so if they were to coordinate, they've got the numbers. They're not very good under pressure, so they make bad decisions. It usually involves violence. So if they were to start something, it usually is a very violent situation to be in as a staff member, because yeah, the prisoners don't think it through sometimes, and they just do things get out of hand, people get hurt or die. So each shift I would do, I'd remind myself I was in their world 8 hours at a time, and I got to do my job because they allowed it. Now, we've got a term, or a couple of terms in New Zealand, it probably applies around the world, but I'm going to talk about them anyway. One is soft cock. Being a soft cock is talking about being a limp penis, is about being spineless, about being a yes man. You can do your job with what I spoke about, being visiting their world and them coordinating. You can do your job without being a soft cock. Okay, I more often than not would tell the prisoners no. If they asked me something they weren't entitled for or entitled to, I would say no. I wouldn't say yes just because I knew that they could take over the jail if they got upset. I had a job to do and I still did my job. And I was very black and white. There were no grey areas. So the prisoners knew where they stood with me. They knew where they stood, and if they weren't entitled to it, they normally wouldn't bother asking me, because they knew the answer would invariably be no. So, you know, you can still do your job, but it's all about respect. Irrespective of what a prisoner has done to get themselves in jail, irrespective of what they've done, you need to treat that person with dignity, under the Human Rights Act and the Geneva Convention, but also with a certain amount of respect. And that respect, as far as I'm concerned, the respect they get is the respect they give, was a direct reflection of the respect they give. So if they're respectful, polite and compliant, doing credit where credit's due, and they'll get a certain amount of respect in return. Now when you're working with these people day in and day out, you get to know them and they get to know you to an extent. You've got to be careful not to share too much of your own personal information, because they can use that against you to get leverage. But you get to know each other's quirks and idiosyncrasies, and quite often you would know how someone wakes up in the morning. So Joe the burglar might normally be very, very happy as he swings his legs out of his bed in the morning, and I've had situations where Joe the burglar and obviously it's not a real person or a real offence, but I'm just using it as an example. Joe the burglar would swing his legs out of bed, and I'd said to this bloke one morning, "Morning, Joe," and he told me to fuck off. Told me to fuck off. So obviously Joe the burglar was having a bad hair day, and for what reason I don't know, but some staff would jump on that straight away and go, "Don't speak to me like that. I'm charging you with a misconduct for behaving in an abusive manner," and they're entitled to do that. But clearly, if you know that Joe the burglar is acting out of sorts, then it's within your best interest to find out why they are acting out of sorts, because it might be the difference between something happening or you preventing something from happening. So, this particular instance where I was told to fuck off by Joe the burglar, I just let him be for a minute, let him wake up, have some breakfast, and then I pulled him aside into the office and said, "Hey Joe, what was with before? Like, the way you spoke to me is unappreciated, and it's disrespectful. What's the issue here? Have I offended you?" He said, "No, you haven't, boss." I said, "So what's the issue here? Because I don't deserve to be spoken to like that." He's apologised and explained that he's got an issue outside the wire with his wife, and one of his kids was sick. So he got a letter that I didn't know about. His wife's thinking about leaving him, and one of his kids is quite ill. So he's explained that to me, and I can understand why. He's behaved the way he has. It doesn't excuse it, but he's apologised. And I'm not big enough of a man to take another man's apology when they sincerely apologise. Even if a line has been crossed, where I've said to him, like, "Don't speak to me like that again, please. Otherwise, if you do so, you're going to be charged." So I've given him a formal warning. Obviously, if Joe the burglar constantly behaves like a dickhead, then he's not going to get as much leniency or understanding. He's going to get charged pretty much straight away. But some prisoners are very, very easy to deal with. Very easy to deal with. They just get up, they do what they need to do, they do as they're told. They don't push their luck. They get on and do their lag, and a lag is a sentence. So they get on and do their time without winding people up, without causing issues, without pressing buttons. They just do their lag. And that's the saying, get on and do your lag. So if someone's being a crybaby and starting trouble in a wing or in a unit, often you'll hear that being yelled out. Handle your lag. Just do your lag. So it'd be the term you hear. So you can treat people with respect, even if they are pedophiles, murderers, rapists, thugs, burglars, and thieves. You can treat them with respect. How much leeway you give them, whilst still applying policy, procedure, and legislation, is up to the individual. Obviously, you need to behave with morality and integrity, and remain professional at all times. And as soon as you step away from those virtues or values, you stand or run the risk of getting got, which is about being corrupted, which happens, unfortunately. And in my role over the years, I've done quite a few things in the prison. I was a staff trainer for a decade. I was a regional trainer, so I travelled to other prisons doing different trainings, and they would include tactical communication, tactical exit strategy, pepper spray, what else? New arrival at risk assessments, suicide awareness, hostage awareness, first responding officer training, all that kind of stuff. I was the drug liaison officer for about 12 months, so it was my job to gather intel and info and work with, my jail at the time was right next to a military base, so we'd work with military police because we shared a border, so sometimes offenders would make it onto army property to try and introduce contraband into the prison by throwing it over the fence. So we'd work with military police and recon squad or recon platoon to do surveillance. Would search vehicles and would travel between jails as well, using intel and information to try and remove drugs, cell phones, weapons, and to gather further intel. New Zealand has a number of ethnic gangs which are quite strong within prisons, so often you'd be able to pick up bits of information around what a gang's doing in other jails, or what's the next move for the gang within a certain prison. So you'd search for that kind of stuff, upholding cell standards as well to make sure they they don't have more than what they should have in their cell. So that was another job I had. I was on the riot squad for about 5 years, or what we call the ACR team, Advanced Control and Restraint Team. And then I became PNT, which is the Prison Negotiation Team. I'm a police-trained hostage negotiator, and actually still maintain that role even though I don't work in the prison. I'm still a hostage negotiator. So yeah, it was a very interesting 16 years. It had its moments where I thought I was never going to walk out of the jail ever again. There was probably a half a dozen times where I thought my number was up. The old adage, treat people as you would like to be treated, also rings fairly true inside the jail. You can issue instructions and orders with prisoners without being a dick. You don't have to be an arrogant dick to be able to do your job. You're more likely to get respect if you treat people a certain way, and treating people like rubbish just because you're wearing a uniform is a fast road to getting assaulted. You don't have to be some kind of narcissistic, egotistical, arrogant knob to get the job done. And it's quite nice actually when I might be walking down the street or walking through the supermarket, and I will often come across ex-prisoners, and they'll say g'day to me. They'll say g'day mister, or g'day boss, how's things going, do you remember me? And obviously if they've had a positive interaction with me, they're more likely to come over and talk. Those guys that you sort of you butt heads with aren't probably going to cross the street to say hello. But I've never had any issues with ex-prisoners. Never had any issues. I've even been at my home, and ex-prisoners have walked past and actually, come to my driveway to have a chat. And they'll tell you about what they're doing in their lives, what's different, what's new, what changes they've made, if any, the positive things happening in their lives, and I'll share. And it's quite nice to hear those things and know that potentially the way that you worked with them may have had something to do with that. Because as I said before, a lot of the time these guys, they're no good with their crisis management. They're not very good at making decisions or sound decisions. Their cost-benefit analysis is quite poor. Sometimes you'll have prisoners will lose the plot with you. They'll lose the plot with you and start acting out, because that's the only way they know how to do things, is to add aggression and anger and you know, curse at you. But if you remain cool under pressure and keep calm and professional, it displays to them that there is other ways of dealing with stressful situations. It's something called pro-social modelling. And I'm not for a second saying that if someone's becoming assaultive that you need to stand there and take that shit. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if someone's yelling at you and you don't feel threatened, if you remain calm and professional, it de-escalates that person, because you're not raising the stakes by acting in like or in kind. It de-escalates the person, and afterwards they may realise that you stayed calm the whole time, and that they don't necessarily have to lose the plot and get angry or yell or get abusive. And sometimes they take those things on board and they apply them to their lives. You know, I'm not saying that every time a prison officer talks to a prisoner, lives are changed. I'm not saying that. I'm saying sometimes it may give the prisoner something to think about. Yeah, there are times where aggressive prisoners become assaultive, and you have to deal with that kind of behaviour pretty quickly. One way of dealing with that behaviour in the job is something called CNR, control and restraint. Control and restraint is authorised techniques, authorised government approved techniques that you use to inflict pain to gain control. Pain compliance is what it is. That's like bending wrists and certain things like that. Very rarely do you break any bones or tear tendons or muscles. It's all about pressure points. So if there's an assaultive prisoner and there's 3 or more staff, then they must attempt to use control and restraint. If there's an assaultive prisoner and there is 1 or 2 officers present, then they can use reasonable and proportionate force to gain control of the situation. And the same applies if there's one officer there and the shit starts hitting the fan, then you use proportionate, reasonable force in the circumstances to be the one who walks away from it, or is the least injured, in my opinion. And in an environment like that, normally it's you do whatever it takes kind of thing. That's not a boxing match. It can get pretty down and dirty. Not in a sexual way either, but yeah, it can be a very dangerous situation. I was only ever assaulted once in my 16 years. As some of you know, I'm about 6 foot tall and I'm quite a big boy, but I don't like violence. I'm not a conscientious objector or anything. If someone forces my hand, I will fight. What I don't like doing is I don't like getting into those situations, because I tend to lose the plot. And the fights that I have been in, I'm not the one who ends up getting hurt most of the time. So what I will do is I will tend to try and talk a situation down, or de-escalate it, or use a tactical option. You could disengage, okay? You could disengage, whereby you might enter a cell and the prisoner is angry or becomes assaultive, and whatever you entered the cell for doesn't have to happen right then and there. So you you disengage. You lock the door. Job done. There's no need for people to get hurt or you to roll around on the floor with a prisoner. You might delay it, so you might enter that cell, the person becomes aggressive and assaultive, but you might have to move that prisoner to a different cell, and they might not want to go, but they have to move, so you delay it. You step away, allow them to calm down, and then you come back with the right resources, so more staff or a riot shield, or someone to communicate, and yeah, you delay it. There's always an option, and the department's policy was to, or is, to deal with any situation with the lowest force possible. So it's not about coming to blows straight away. Dealing with the lowest force possible. If you've got someone who's angry and aggressive, try and talk to them to the point where they can calm down and maybe see the logic behind what it is you're asking them to do or telling them to do, where they get time to consider the consequences should they not comply. But yeah, in my 16 and a half years I was only assaulted once, and that was in about the first 6 to 12 months of the job. And I'm not a big bully boy. I never had to walk around trying to be staunch, trying to be the tough guy to do my job or get my way, or have them carry out an order to gain compliance. Yeah, so it must have been something, and I think it's maybe my reputation, where they knew that I was firm but fair, and I meant what I said. So who knows, I'd have to do a survey and ask them